Hey,
The experience of class this weekend was pretty amazing.
oh, good.
And as you described trauma and the effects on the body,
Yeah.
I I was listening to that and thinking of my mother-in-law, who we've talked about, who has moderate dementia.
Hmm.
And there's a similarity in the symptoms
Hmm.
of the effects of trauma and the effects of dementia. And
Hmm.
part of me says that maybe it's more trauma with her that started all
It, it,
these.
it, it can be, and if you think about dementia, like the person feels a lot of like lack of control. Like they feel out
Yes.
of control because they don't remember things, and so they're just constantly in these situations where they don't understand, or things aren't the way that they thought they were, or they forgot, or they get a little disoriented, and so
Uh-huh.
all those actually kind of traumatizing. And,
She's
and so
she
trauma could
says,
have gotten her there, and then trauma could also be continuing because, that's the thing. Like when we think of trauma, when we talk about it like from a psychological point of view, we think of like, well, this person did this, or this person did that, or this situation did this. When it can be like even just how people treated you at work that wasn't really insulting, but maybe they were a little condescending or discounting or didn't value, but also it can be body pain. It can be a lot of inflammation. It could be all kinds of like physical sensations that actually register as trauma, emotionally as trauma, and so trauma is pretty. I mean, if you go through and you measure like people's like stress levels and trauma levels and fear levels and all those things, trauma is usually by far the biggest, like by far. Like, and it's just because we just constantly get a little bombarded by things, like even like I kind of start to go down this rabbit hole sometimes, but it's just so abstract that I usually stop myself, just because it feels like a little bit like me just talking rather than educating. But sometimes when we have like certain viewpoints or certain perceptions, and when things in the world challenge those viewpoints and those perceptions, that right there is a significant trauma. Like if you think about, like, if somebody that is doing something and it's not really impacting you, but it's like it kind of goes against what you think is should be happening, or what they should do, or what's the proper thing to do, you notice that it kind of stirs a little something in you, and it might not be
mhm,
anger, but it's a little agitating, right? that
yes.
that is something is challenging your perception or your viewpoint, and that is probably one of the biggest sources of trauma. Is you could almost say the harder, the stronger a person has opinions about something or viewpoints, the potential for trauma is more significant, because those viewpoints are going to get challenged, or those opinions are going to get challenged. And so sometimes you'll notice, like when people have gone through a lot of trauma, that's very like this happened and that happened and this happened, and then you kind of watch them in the world and something will happen, they'll go, I don't care. Like it's almost like they're having to detach from those opinions. They don't do it like consciously, but they're doing it because I got to pump the brakes on all this trauma, and it's kind of
Right.
tied to how you go through and process the trauma. And so um, when we were evaluating people like way back in the day, and we were doing things with like abuse victims and stuff, one of the things that I would always push is I would tell the therapist, I was like, we need to ask them a series of questions that has nothing to do with them or their past, so we can see like how they process the world. Like, do they have really strong opinions? Do they have really light opinions? Because that right there will be an indicator of how you'll treat them. And um, the ones that had stronger like stronger opinions or stronger viewpoints of like what should happen in the world or what's good in this situation or that situation. And they weren't necessarily negative viewpoints. It was just they were really firm on their viewpoint. They tended to have more trauma that needed to be released, if that makes sense.
Yes. So in my mother-in-law's case, I was talking with my wife last night, and basically there's some trauma that I had forgotten about in her life from like the very first month she was born, and there's been traumas that I'm aware of throughout her life.
Right.
And I've always felt she was stuck, like not processing that trauma and getting past it. And after
Right.
taking the class, it was like, oh, all these symptoms could be a result of all
Yeah.
these
Yeah. Very well could
traumas.
be. Yeah. Very well could be.
So, so part
Mm,
of the reason for bringing this up is I sort of made a decision last night and said, okay, let's take her off of what we were doing for the dementia and focus on the trauma
mhm.
and do that for a while.
Sure. 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 Sure.
And then once we can start to see a shift there, move to the lymphatic part that is definitely out of whack as well.
Yeah.
That fight, flight, freeze. Well, she's
Mhm.
definitely in that. So
Mhm.
we need to deal with the trauma so we can deal with the lymphatic so that things will be more what's her true normal.
Right. And so like if you are going to engage that and you're going to integrate it with like doing some healing, you could do the trauma release technique from the weekend, and then if you need to have it be a little bit more accelerated, just after that, just clean your solar plexus front and back, because a majority of where it's going to come out is the solar plexus.
Okay.
The solar plexus is a reflection of what happens in the lower centers, and then it's a reflection of things that happen in the mind, like the upper centers, but mostly like ajna throat area. And so sometimes it's not so much that it's in the ajna and throat, but it's reflected in what happens in the solar plexus. So a lot of times what happens is it's just kind of coming out the solar. Yeah.
Okay. So uh, because of the dementia symptoms, her ability to focus and do anything for a length of time is limited. So we're starting like with the first page of the trauma release technique and doing one section of it at a time and doing it multiple times a day. So we sort of like you did in class,
Mhm.
went through it the first time,
Yeah.
so go through it over and over and over to have an effect before we move on and do more of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I'll let you know down the road how
Yeah,
it
I'd
goes.
be very curious. Like,
Yeah.
going back, just like within my family, my grandfather on my mother's side, um, he was a very opinionated guy, like very, very opinionated, and he he would never use the word trauma, but like you just over the years, you could see it. You know what I mean.
Mhm.
And as he got older, he got a little bit more bitter and bitter. And then the dementia set in. And it's a very interesting thing. It's like what we were talking about before. They either go to a place where they get more aggressive or they almost become kind of childlike and they just kind of almost let it all go. And
Yeah.
that's the direction he ended up going, which was really surprising because it was not his personality. Like it was the opposite of his personality. But um, trauma got him there.
Yeah.
For his situation, I can say trauma is what got him there. Like,
And
and I remember having a conversation with Master Chola, and this is an interesting thing, and maybe I've said this to you guys, maybe I haven't, but he said that sometimes when there's like memory loss, and so I would include dementia in this. He said sometimes when somebody has a hard time letting go of something, the physiology tries to manage it, and the manifestation is a little bit of memory loss or a little bit of dementia. And it doesn't mean that memory loss is that you have a hard time letting go, because sometimes it's just your physiology and poor circulation, or there's inflammation. But when there is something that is unresolved as you get older, the physiology tries to handle that, like, just let go of it, because you are kind of preparing for the transition. And the more, even if the transition is 10 years away, like, the more that you're entangled in it, the harder time you have after the fact. So he said it's a mechanism of the soul to go, let's just start forgetting this now. And so, I mean, I kind of like your theory. Like, maybe we just could double down on some trauma and do some trauma work and unwind that. And at the very least, it helps her, feel a little bit better, at the end of her life, and potentially helps her in the transition time. But it might actually change and shift the dementia. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I
So
like that theory.
we're experimenting.
And go at a pace that she can handle. It doesn't have to be, a blistering pace or anything. I mean, but
Yeah, we got it.
but yeah. So
Great. Thanks.
you're so welcome.